If I put two bottles of Prosecco in front of you, one labeled Brut and the other extra dry, which one would you expect to be drier? Extra dry sounds obvious. It is wrong. Brut is actually the drier wine, and that is only the first thing about Prosecco that becomes more interesting once you look past the familiar bottle. Because Prosecco is not simply inexpensive Italian bubbles. Where it comes from matters. The way it is made matters, and two bottles carrying the same famous name can taste surprisingly different. So in this guide, we are going to find out what Prosecco really is, why different bottles can taste so different, and what I actually look for when choosing one. But first, what makes a wine Prosecco, and what I actually look for when choosing one? Prosecco is not a generic Italian word for sparkling wine. It is a protected wine tied to a defined part of northeastern Italy. The broad Prosecco DOCG area stretches across 9 provinces in Veneto and Friuli Venezia Giulia, covering a large territory that includes both relatively flat agricultural land and increasingly hilly country farther north. The grape behind most of it is called Glera, and this is where the story gets slightly confusing. For a long time, the grape itself was also widely known as Prosecco. When the modern Prosecco DOCG framework was established in 2009, the name Prosecco became firmly tied to the protected wine and its territory, while its principal grape is identified as Glera. Glera explains much of what we recognize in the glass. It tends to produce wines that are light, fresh, and aromatic rather than heavy or powerful. Pear and apple are common, along with citrus, peach, and white flowers. In a simple bottle, those aromas may be immediate and straightforward. In a more expressive one, they can become much more detailed and persistent. For white Prosecco DOCG, at least 85% of the wine must be Glera. Other permitted grapes can make up the rest, but Glera is the foundation. So the easiest way to remember it is this. Prosecco is the protected wine, Glera is the main grape, and northeastern Italy is its home. Most people first meet Prosecco through Prosecco DOCG. This is the broadest denomination and the source of much of the Prosecco found in supermarkets, bars, and restaurants around the world. These wines are generally made around freshness, fruit, and easy drinking. That does not mean they cannot be very good. It simply means that the geographical address on the bottle is still fairly broad. Move toward the hills of Treviso and things start to change. Here you find Asolo Prosecco Superiore, DOCG, and Conegliano Valdobbiadene Prosecco Superiore, DOCG. The names get longer, but the idea is simple. The production areas are becoming more specific. Conegliano and Valdobbiadene are especially important because the hills between them form one of the historic hearts of Prosecco production. If your image of Prosecco is a bottle sitting in a restaurant ice bucket, the landscape can be a surprise. Vineyards climb steep green slopes, broken up by villages, woodland, and narrow grassy terraces. Some of those slopes are difficult enough that working them is a completely different proposition from farming vines on flat land. In 2019, the hills of Conegliano and Valdobbiadene were inscribed on the World Heritage List, recognizing a landscape shaped over centuries by people adapting viticulture to difficult terrain. Once you see those hills, the idea that every Prosecco is basically interchangeable becomes much harder to believe, and the map can narrow again. You may see the word rive on a bottle. A rive wine comes from one of 43 recognized hillside areas within Conegliano Valdobbiadene. Instead of simply telling you the general denomination, the producer is giving you a much more precise address. Then there is Cartizze, Valdobbiadene Superiore di Cartizze, comes from a tiny area of just over 100 hectares around Valdobbiadene. It has held a particularly prestigious reputation for generations and remains one of the most famous names in the Prosecco world. This is the point where it becomes tempting to imagine a neat quality ladder. DOC and DOCG tell you important things about origin and production rules. Vineyard work, harvest timing, fermentation, and final sweetness can all change the personality of the bottle. Think of the classification as a map, not a score. And if you really want to understand what that means, I would not spend an evening memorizing regulations. I would open 2 bottles. Put a good Prosecco DOC beside a Conegliano Valdobbiadene Prosecco Superiore DOCG and taste them at the same time. Do not decide beforehand which one is supposed to win. Notice whether one smells more intensely, whether one feels more delicate, whether the bubbles seem different, or whether the flavor of one remains in your mouth longer. And while you're tasting, pay attention to those bubbles, because the way Prosecco becomes sparkling explains a huge amount about its character. Prosecco DOC Spumante gets its bubbles through a natural second fermentation in large sealed pressure tanks using the martinotti method, also widely known as the Charmat method. It begins as a still wine. The grapes are pressed, the juice ferments, and yeast converts sugar into alcohol. At that point, you have wine, but not the persistent bubbles we associate with Prosecco. The wine then goes into a large, sealed pressure tank for a second fermentation. Yeast begins working again and produces carbon dioxide. Because the tank is closed, that gas cannot simply escape into the air. It dissolves into the wine instead. That is where the bubbles come from. For standard Prosecco, DOC Spumante, that second fermentation lasts at least 30 days. A giant pressure tank may not sound especially romantic, but the method makes a lot of sense for Glera. The grape is attractive because of its fresh fruit and floral character, and the martinotti method is particularly well suited to preserving that side of the wine. You want the pear, apple, citrus, and flowers to survive into the glass. The same method is central to Prosecco Superiore as well, where it is used to preserve the aromatic character of the grapes, while allowing differences in place to remain visible in the finished wine. This is also the moment when champagne inevitably enters the conversation. Prosecco is often treated as cheaper champagne because both wines sparkle and often appear on similar occasions. But in the winery, they take very different paths. In champagne, the second fermentation happens inside the individual bottle. The wine then spends time maturing in contact with the spent yeast. As it develops, this can contribute to the brioche, toast, and pastry-like aromas many people associate with mature champagne. Most Prosecco follows a different route. Its sparkling fermentation takes place in a pressure tank, which helps preserve more of its fresh fruit and floral personality. Sometimes you want something richer, creamier, and more developed. Sometimes you want a sparkling wine that is bright, fragrant, and immediately refreshing. Neither wine needs to imitate the other, so Brut wins the naming game. But here is what the trap from the beginning does not tell you. The amount of sugar on paper does not decide exactly how sweet the wine will taste. At the driest end, you may find Brut Nature, containing no more than 3 grams of sugar per liter. Extra Brut can reach 6 grams per liter, while Brut remains below 12. Extra Dry comes next, with between 12 and 17 grams per liter. And Dry is sweeter again, ranging from 17 to 32 grams per liter. Those figures are useful, but they are only part of what you experience. Acidity changes the way sweetness feels. Carbonation changes it. Temperature changes it. The fruit itself changes it. A balanced, extra-dry Prosecco can contain more sugar than a Brut and still feel fresh rather than obviously sweet. That slight softness can actually work beautifully with Glera, making its pear, peach, and floral qualities feel rounder and more generous. So if the Prosecco you normally drink feels slightly sweeter than you would like, try Brut. If you enjoy the softer, fruitier side, extra dry may be exactly what you want. There is no prize for choosing the driest bottle available. There are a few other words worth knowing. Spumante is the fully sparkling Prosecco most people already know. Frizzante has gentler bubbles. And surprisingly, Prosecco can even exist as tranquillo, meaning completely still. It is much less common, especially outside Italy, but its existence is a useful reminder that Prosecco is a wine denomination first, not simply another word for fizz. Prosecco DOCG. Rosé is another distinct style. It combines between 85 and 90% Glera with between 10 and 15% Pinot Noir. The Pinot Noir is vinified as a red wine before becoming part of the blend, giving the finished wine both its color and part of its flavor. Rosé can only be produced as Spumante, and its second fermentation must last at least 60 days. Then there is millesimato, one of those words that looks far more luxurious than its actual meaning. It tells you that the wine carries a vintage. When millesimato appears on Prosecco, at least 85% of the wine must come from the year shown on the bottle. And this is where all of this starts becoming practical. Imagine I am standing in a wine shop and I need a bottle for a Spritz with friends. I am not hunting for the rarest hillside wine in the room. I would start with a good Prosecco DOCG, and if I prefer the final drink a little crisper, I would probably look for Brut, because the other ingredients already bring plenty of flavor and may bring sweetness of their own. But if I am buying Prosecco because I actually want to sit down and taste the wine, I would start looking toward Asolo Prosecco Superiore DOCG or Conegliano Valdobbiadene Prosecco Superiore DOCG. Not because the letters guarantee a better evening, but because now I am asking the bottle for more than cold bubbles. I want to know whether a more specific place gives me something I can actually taste. And from that point, the producer becomes more useful than collecting classifications. If you need somewhere to begin, names such as Nino Franco, Adami, and Ruggeri give you 3 established starting points in Conegliano Valdobbiadene. They are not a ranking, and they are certainly not the only producers worth exploring. From there, curiosity can take over. Try a rive. Try Cartizze. Compare 2 producers from the same denomination. Once you have bought a good bottle, give it a fair chance. Prosecco is generally best served cold, around 6 to 8 degrees Celsius. You want it fresh and lively, but not so cold that every aroma disappears. A more interesting bottle can actually become more expressive as it warms slightly in the glass. The classic narrow flute looks elegant, but if you actually want to smell the wine, a fairly large tulip-shaped glass gives the aromas more room. Even a normal white wine glass can work well if that is what you have available. Then just smell it for a few seconds. You notice pear, apple, citrus, peach, or flowers. Prosecco is so closely associated with aperitivo that people sometimes act as though the bottle should disappear as soon as dinner begins. But acidity and bubbles make it remarkably useful at the table. Fried seafood is an obvious example. The food is hot, salty, and rich. The wine is cold, fresh, and sparkling. Each sip resets the palate. That same logic works with calamari, shellfish, cured meats, fresh cheeses, and vegetables. In Veneto, Prosecco feels completely natural with cicchetti, but there is no reason to keep the pairing Italian. Sushi can work beautifully. Salty fried food can be excellent. Seafood and lighter pasta dishes are natural territory. The useful thing is understanding why the combination works. Acidity refreshes richness. Bubbles refresh the palate. Salt works beautifully with fresh wine. And a little sweetness can be helpful when the food brings sweetness or spice of its own. Prosecco can stay with you through dinner. Its job does not end with the aperitivo. As for keeping the bottle for years, most Prosecco is made to be enjoyed while its fruit is fresh. Its floral aromas are lively, and the bubbles still feel energetic. The official guidance for Prosecco DOCG is to enjoy it young, ideally in the year following the harvest. Some more serious bottles can evolve in interesting ways, but long aging is not the central point of the style. And if you open one and do not finish it, use a proper sparkling wine stopper and put it back in the refrigerator. The real difference after all of this is not that you suddenly need to memorize every Italian term on a Prosecco label. You do not. It is that the bottles should no longer look completely interchangeable. Instead of reaching automatically for the nicest label, you can have some idea of what is likely to be inside the bottle. If you enjoyed this guide, subscribe